What happens when a single dad risks everything to rescue two army daughters trapped in the path of a devastating tornado, only to discover that their emergency radio holds the key to a miracle no one saw coming? This isn't just a story about surviving nature's fury. It's about the moment when a stranger's courage becomes the bridge between a broken family and the father they thought they'd lost forever. When the winds die down and the static clears, what emerges from that radio will change everything these three people believed about hope, healing, and the power of never giving up on the ones we love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Gideon Beckett had learned that Thursday mornings were the hardest, not because of his construction job at Willowbrook Development, where he spent his days laying foundation stones for new homes across the sprawling suburb of Havenbrook Valley, not because of the bills stacked on his kitchen counter, or the washing machine that made that concerning grinding noise every third cycle. Thursday mornings were hard because they marked exactly 1 week since Emma's funeral, then 2 weeks, then 3, and now he glanced at the calendar hanging crooked above the coffee maker. 20-7 weeks since he'd become the only parent. His 8-year-old son, Daniel, had left. The boys sat at their small kitchen table, methodically eating cereal while reading the back of the box with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. His dark hair stuck up in 3 different directions. Despite Gideon's attempts with water and a comb, Daniel had Emma's eyes curious, warm, always looking for the good in things, and lately, those eyes held a quiet sadness that made Gideon's chest ache. "Dad," Daniel said without looking up from his cereal box, "did you know that honey never spoils, like never ever?" Gideon smiled despite the weight settling on his shoulders. "Is that right? They found honey in Egyptian tombs that was still good after thousands of years." Daniel finally looked up, milk dripping from his spoon. "Maybe. That's why bees are so important. They make things that last forever." Emma would have known exactly what to say to that. She would have launched into one of her impromptu lessons about ancient civilizations or the biology of bees, turning a simple breakfast into an adventure of learning. Gideon just nodded and refilled his coffee mug, trying not to think about how many conversations like this he was probably getting wrong. "That's pretty amazing, buddy," he managed. "Speaking of lasting forever, did you brush your teeth?" Daniel grinned, the first real smile Gideon had seen all week, and bolted from the table. Through the kitchen window, Gideon could see the morning sky stretching gray and restless over Havenbrook Valley. The weather had been strange all week, unseasonably warm for October in Missouri, with clouds that seemed to churn and shift like they couldn't decide what they wanted to become. His foreman had mentioned possible storms, but in this part of the state, storm warnings were as common as traffic lights. You learn to keep an eye on the sky and trust your instincts. His phone buzzed against the counter. A text from his sister Claire in Portland. "How are you holding up?" Daniel's school pictures turned out adorable. "You're doing great, Gid." He stared at the message for a long moment. Doing great felt like an overstatement. Most days he felt like he was barely treading water, trying to be everything Daniel needed while learning how to parent without Emma's steady wisdom guiding every decision. She had been the organized one, the one who remembered doctor's appointments and school events and which vegetables Daniel actually ate. Gideon was good with his hands, good at fixing broken things and building something solid from raw materials. But parenting an 8-year-old boy through grief while navigating his own felt like constructing a house without blueprints. "Dad, I'm ready." Daniel appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, hair somehow even more disheveled than before. Gideon grabbed his keys and work jacket, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. At 34, he looked older than he felt, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when Emma was alive. But Daniel was looking at him with trust and expectation, the same expression he'd worn since he was a toddler, And Gideon felt that familiar surge of fierce love mixed with terrifying responsibility. They drove through Havenbrook Valley's quiet streets in comfortable silence, Daniel humming softly to himself while watching the world wake up outside his window. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone, which had its advantages and disadvantages. People still brought casseroles and asked how they were doing with the kind of earnest concern that made Gideon both grateful and exhausted. Well-meaning neighbors offered advice about grief, counseling, and single parenting that he nodded at politely while feeling completely overwhelmed. Mrs. Patterson says there might be a tornado watch today, Daniel said as they pulled into the school parking lot. Gideon glanced at the sky again. The clouds did look more aggressive than usual, building into towering formations that seemed to stretch impossibly high. Mrs. Patterson knows about weather. She grew up on a farm. She says you can smell storms coming. Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to face his father. Can you smell anything? Gideon rolled down his window and breathed in the morning air. It did smell different, electric, charged with something restless and waiting. Yeah, buddy. I think Mrs. Patterson might be right. After dropping Daniel off, Gideon drove toward the construction site, but the uneasy feeling in his stomach had nothing to do with the weather. It was the same feeling he'd carried for months now, the sense that he was constantly one step behind, trying to catch up to a life that had changed. Overnight, Emma had handled so much of their daily rhythm that he was still discovering gaps he didn't know existed. Parent-teacher conferences he'd forgotten about, permission slips that arrived home unsigned, moments when Daniel needed something Gideon didn't know how to give, but this morning felt different. Maybe it was the charged air or the way the clouds seemed to be gathering with unusual purpose, but something told him this Thursday was going to break the pattern. Whether that would be for better or worse, he couldn't say. He just knew that by tonight, nothing would be the same. The first warning came at 11:47 a.m., crackling through the radio in Gideon's work truck as he measured foundation markers at the Willowbrook site. This is the National Weather Service issuing a tornado watch for Havenbrook County and surrounding areas. Conditions are favorable for severe thunderstorm development with possible tornado activity. Residents should monitor weather conditions and be prepared to take shelter. Gideon looked up from his measuring tape. The sky had darkened considerably since morning, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. His crew was already glancing nervously. At the horizon were massive thunderheads towered like mountains, made of smoke and shadow. Probably just another watch that turns into nothing, called out Tommy, his site supervisor, but even he sounded uncertain. By noon, the wind had picked up enough to scatter loose debris across the construction site. Gideon was securing equipment when his phone rang. Daniel's school, Mr. Beckett. This is Principal Rodriguez. We're implementing our severe weather protocol and asking parents to pick up their children early as a precaution. Gideon's stomach tightened. How early? We'd like everyone here by 1:30 if possible. The storm system is moving faster than initially predicted. He was already walking toward his truck. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive through town revealed a community taking the warning seriously. Gas stations had lines of cars, and the grocery store parking lot was unusually full for a Thursday afternoon. But what caught Gideon's attention was the traffic on Highway 67, the main route that connected Havenbrook Valley to the interstate. Vehicles were streaming in both directions, some clearly evacuating, others possibly seeking shelter in town. Was waiting in the school lobby with his backpack, calmer than most of the other children being picked up early. Mrs. Patterson was right about the storm smell, he said as they walked to the truck. It's really strong now. The boy was right. The air carried an almost metallic scent, electric and sharp, like the moment before lightning strikes. Gideon had heard old-timers describe it, but he'd never experienced it himself. They were halfway home when the radio cut through static with an urgent tone. The National Weather Service has issued a tornado Warning for eastern Havenbrook County. Doppler radar has indicated rotation in the storm system currently moving through the area. Take shelter immediately. Daniel sat up straighter. Dad, that's us, right? Eastern Havenbrook County. Before Gideon could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. Hello? Is this Gideon Beckett? The voice was young, female, tight with barely controlled panic. Double quotes. Yes, who's this? My name is Kira Stone. We're stranded on Millfield Road, about 2 miles east of your town. Our car broke down, and there's a tornado coming. I got your number. From Directory Assistance. Please, we need help. Gideon's mind raced. Millfield Road was rural, mostly farmland with scattered houses. In severe weather, it would be isolated and dangerous. How many people? 2, my sister Juniper and me. We're soldiers. We're home on leave visiting our grandmother, but her house is too far to reach on foot. The tornado sirens are going off, and we can see rotation in the clouds. Please, we don't have anywhere else to call. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through his windshield, Gideon could see the wall cloud approaching from the west, dark and ominous with tendrils of cloud matter spinning visibly beneath it. Every instinct told him to get Daniel home and into their basement. Immediately, Dad? Daniel was watching him, those 2 perceptive eyes reading his father's conflict. Where exactly on Millfield Road? Gideon heard himself ask. Near the old red barn with the collapsed roof. There's a rusted mailbox marked Henley. Nearby, he knew the spot. It was at least 15 minutes away, in the opposite direction from safety. Taking Daniel toward an approaching tornado violated every parental instinct he possessed. Please, Kira's voice broke slightly. We're 23 years old. We've served 2 deployments, but we've never faced anything like this. The winds are getting stronger, and we can see debris in the air. Gideon closed his eyes for a moment, hearing Emma's voice in his memory. You don't abandon people who need help. That's not who we are. Dad, we have to help them, Daniel said quietly. Right? The tornado sirens began wailing across Havenbrook Valley, a sound that made every cell in Gideon's body scream for shelter. Through the radio, an emergency broadcaster was urging residents to take cover immediately. The storm was moving at 35 miles per hour, giving them perhaps 20 minutes before it reached town. Listen to me carefully, Gideon said into the phone, already turning the truck around. Find the strongest structure you can, a ditch, a culvert, anything below ground level. We're coming to get you, but it's going to be close. Thank you, Kira breathed. Thank you so much. Gideon ended the call and looked at Daniel. Buddy, I need you to understand something. This is dangerous. We're going to get these ladies and bring them somewhere safe, but the storm is moving fast. Daniel nodded solemnly. Like when you helped Mrs. Chun dig out her car last winter, but bigger. Much bigger. Gideon pressed the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb. I need you to put on your seatbelt and hold on tight. And Daniel? Yeah, Dad? If I tell you to do something, you do it immediately. No questions, no hesitation. Okay. As they drove east toward Millfield Road, the sky continued to darken, taking on an eerie greenish tint that veteran storm watchers knew meant serious trouble. Behind them, Havenbrook Valley disappeared into a wall of rain and wind. Ahead, somewhere in the rapidly deteriorating weather, 2 young women were counting on a stranger to risk everything for them. Gideon gripped the steering wheel tighter and drove toward the storm. The radio crackled again. Multiple tornadoes confirmed on the ground in Havenbrook County. This is an extremely dangerous situation. Take shelter now. Daniel reached over and squeezed his father's arm. We're going to make it, Dad. Gideon hoped his son was right. The world transformed as they drove deeper into the storm's path. What? had been a typical October afternoon in rural Missouri became something alien and hostile. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes, and the wind began hitting the truck in violent gusts that made Gideon fight for control of the steering wheel. "Dad, look at that," Daniel whispered, pointing toward the western horizon. Gideon glanced in the rearview mirror and felt his blood chill. The tornado was visible now, a dark writhing column stretching from the churning clouds to the earth below. It looked impossibly large, like something out of a disaster movie, except this was real and it was following roughly the same path they were traveling. "How fast is it moving?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Fast." "Enough," Gideon replied, pressing harder on the accelerator. The truck's engine roared as they hit 70 miles per hour on the narrow county road. "But we're going to beat it." The radio continued its stream of urgent warnings. ... Confirmed, EF3. Tornado on the ground moving northeast at 40 miles per hour. Multiple structures damaged in the Willowbrook area. ... All residents in the path should take immediate shelter. ... Gideon's heart sank. Willowbrook, that was where he'd been working this morning. His construction site, the half-built homes where he'd spent months laying foundations, all of it was likely gone or damaged. But there was no time to process that. Lost now, the rain hit them like a physical assault, turning the windshield into a waterfall despite the wipers running at full speed. Gideon leaned forward, squinting through the deluge, looking for landmarks. Millfield Road was mostly farmland, with mailboxes and driveways scattered miles apart. In good weather, it was easy to navigate. In this storm, everything looked the same: gray, violent, and dangerous. "There!" Daniel pointed to a flash of red through the rain. "Is that the barn?" Gideon squinted and saw it, the collapsed roof Kira had mentioned, now barely visible through the sheets of rain. But where were the women? He slowed the truck, scanning the roadside ditches and fields. His phone rang again. "We're here." Kira's voice was barely audible over the wind. "We can see your headlights. We're in the drainage culvert about 50 yards. South of the barn." Gideon spotted them, two figures huddled in a concrete drainage pipe that ran under the road. They were soaked and obviously terrified, but alive. He pulled the truck as close as possible and threw it into park. "Daniel, stay in the truck," he ordered, but his son was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Dad, they'll need help getting in." "I can open the back door." There was no time to argue. The tornado was closer now, its roar audible even over the wind and rain. Gideon could see debris spinning in the air, pieces of wood, metal, things he couldn't identify whirling like deadly confetti. He jumped out of the truck and immediately understood why people described tornadoes as freight trains. The sound was overwhelming, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The wind nearly knocked him over as he ran toward the culvert. The two women emerged from the drainage, pipe like refugees from a war zone. Both were tall and athletic, with short military haircuts now plastered to their skulls. One had blood on her forehead from where something had struck her. Despite their obvious fear, they moved with the disciplined coordination of trained soldiers. "I'm Kira," the first one shouted over the storm. "This is my sister Juniper." "Gideon, let's go." They ran toward the truck together, but the wind was getting stronger, making each step a battle. Halfway there, a piece of sheet metal sailed past them, missing Juniper by inches. She stumbled, and Gideon caught her arm, steadying her. "Almost there." He yelled. Daniel had the rear door open, and all four of them piled into the truck, just as the tornado sirens reached a new level of urgency. Through the rain-streaked windows, they could see the tornado clearly now, a massive dark column, maybe half a mile away and moving directly toward them. "Where can we go?" Kira asked, her military composure cracking slightly. "Our grandmother's house is 10 miles north." "But too far," Gideon said, already turning the truck around. There's a storm shelter at Harmony Baptist Church, about 3 miles back toward town. But as they drove, it became clear that 3 miles might as well be 300. The tornado was moving faster than predicted, and debris was falling around. Then, like hail, a tree branch cracked against the windshield, leaving a spider web of fractures. "Dad," Daniel said quietly, "the road ahead ... Gideon looked and felt his stomach drop. About half a mile ahead, a massive oak tree had fallen across the road, completely blocking their path. Behind them, the tornado continued its relentless approach. "There," Juniper said suddenly, pointing to their right, "that farmhouse with the storm cellar." Gideon saw it, an old white farmhouse with a concrete storm cellar built into a small hill behind it. The house itself looked abandoned, but the cellar appeared intact. He yanked the steering wheel right, driving across a field that was rapidly turning to mud. The truck bounced and skidded, but held traction. As they pulled up behind the farmhouse, the tornado was close enough that they could see individual pieces of debris spinning within it. A car door, what looked like part of a roof, objects that had once been someone's life, now transformed into weapons of destruction. "Everyone out," Gideon shouted. "Stay together and run for the cellar." They abandoned the truck and ran through the storm toward the concrete structure. The cellar door was heavy and wooden, with an old-fashioned iron latch. Gideon pulled it open, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. "Go, go, go." Kira and Juniper descended first, followed by Daniel. Gideon took one last look at the approaching tornado, now close enough that he could feel the pressure change in his ears, and followed them into the darkness, pulling the heavy door shut just as the storm's fury reached them. In the sudden, relative quiet of the underground shelter, 4 strangers huddled together, listening to the sound of the world being torn apart above their heads. The storm cellar was larger than Gideon had expected, stretching back into shadows that his phone's flashlight couldn't quite reach. The walls were solid stone, probably built in the 1940s when farmhouses like this one routinely included tornado shelters. Metal shelving lined one wall, holding dusty canning jars and emergency supplies that looked like they'd been there for decades. Above them, the tornado passed with a sound unlike anything Gideon had ever experienced. It wasn't just wind, it was destruction made audible. The grinding, tearing, crashing noise of a world being dismantled piece by piece. The wooden door rattled violently in its frame, but the concrete structure held firm. Daniel pressed close to his father's side, his small body trembling, not just from cold, but from the overwhelming sensory assault happening above their heads. Kira and Juniper sat against the opposite wall, their military bearing evident, even in crisis, as they automatically positioned themselves to face the entrance and assess their surroundings. "How long do these usually last?" Juniper asked, raising her voice over the chaos above. "The tornado itself?" "Maybe 10 or 15 minutes, Gideon replied. "But the storm system could keep going for hours." Kira nodded, then winced as she touched the cut on her forehead. "We were visiting our grandmother when our car broke down. Ancient transmission should have seen it coming. We called for a tow truck, but..." She gestured toward the ceiling, where the storm continued its rampage. "Where's your grandmother now?" Daniel asked, his curiosity overcoming his fear. "Traveling," Juniper said with a slight smile. "She's on some kind of senior's cruise to Alaska. Probably the safest place she could be right now." As the immediate terror of the tornado's passage began to subside, the sound moving farther east, Gideon started exploring their temporary shelter. The stone walls were solid and dry, with what appeared to be a small ventilation system built into the back wall. Whoever had constructed this cellar had known what they were doing. "Look at this," he said, moving deeper into the space. His flashlight beam revealed a workbench against the far wall, covered with a canvas tarp. When he pulled the tarp away, he found something unexpected: a vintage radio setup, complete with what looked like a CB radio, an emergency weather radio, and some kind of amateur radio equipment. "Is that thing from the Civil War?" Kira asked, joining him at the workbench. "Probably 1950s or 60s, Gideon said, examining the equipment more closely. "But it looks well maintained." He found a battery pack connected to the system, and when he flipped a switch, a small green light flickered to life. "Incredible. Still has power." Juniper moved closer, her eyes brightening with interest. "I worked with communications equipment during my deployment. Mind if I take a look? Be my guest." While Juniper examined the radio setup, Gideon continued exploring the shelter. The shelving held not just old canning jars, but also emergency supplies that someone had kept surprisingly current. Bottled water, crackers, first aid supplies, even a few blankets that smelled of cedar but were clean and dry. Whoever lived here was prepared, he told Daniel, handing him a bottle of water and a granola bar from the supplies. "Dad, look at this," Daniel said, pointing to a wall near the entrance. Gideon turned his flashlight toward where his son was pointing and saw something. That made him pause. Taped to the stone wall were several pieces of paper hand-drawn maps of the local area, emergency contact numbers, and what appeared to be a list of radio frequencies with notes beside them. But what caught his attention was a photograph, yellowed, with age but still clear, a family standing in front of the farmhouse above them. "That looks like the house we're under," Daniel observed in the photo. A man in his 30s stood with his arm around a woman of similar age, while a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood in front of them. The girl had pigtails and a gap-toothed grin that radiated joy. Written on the back in fading ink were the words, "The Hendricks family, summer 1978. Got it working," Juniper announced from the radio station. The weather radio crackled to life, immediately filling the cellar with an automated voice updating storm conditions. But she was adjusting other dials, bringing in different signals. "The CB radio works too, and there's something else here. Some kind of long-range amateur radio setup." Static filled the air as she tuned through various frequencies, picking up fragments of conversation, emergency responders coordinating rescue efforts, utility companies reporting power outages, families trying to contact each other across the storm-damaged region. "The tornadoes moved past Havenbrook Valley," she reported, listening to the emergency broadcasts. "Looks like it stayed mostly south of the main town, but there's significant damage to rural areas." Gideon felt relief wash over him. His house might have survived, and Daniel's school would be safe. But that relief was tempered by worry for his work crew and all the other people who might have been caught in the storm's path. "I'm picking up something interesting on this frequency," Juniper said, fine-tuning one of the dials. "It's not emergency services. Sounds like someone trying to reach family members." As she worked with the radio, Kira had found the Coleman lantern among the supplies and managed to get it lit, filling the cellar with warm, steady light. The difference was immediate and profound. The space went from feeling like a cave to feeling like refuge. "This is better," she said, settling back down beside her sister. "Mr. Beckett, I can't thank you enough for coming to get us. You risked your life for 2 complete strangers." Gideon looked at her, then at Juniper working intently with the radio equipment, then at Daniel who was quietly studying the old family photograph. "My wife used to say that we're all connected, even when we don't realize it. That helping someone else is really just helping a part of yourself that you haven't met yet." "She sounds wise," Kira said softly. "She was," he paused, watching Daniel trace the faces in the photograph with his finger. "She died 8 months ago, cancer." The admission surprised him. He hadn't meant to share something so personal with these strangers, but something about their situation huddled together in this underground sanctuary while the storm raged above seemed to strip away the usual barriers people maintained. "I'm sorry," Juniper said, looking up from the radio. We know what loss feels like." Before Gideon could ask what she meant, The radio crackled with a new signal. This one was different, clearer, more personal than the emergency broadcasts they'd been hearing. ... Calling CQ. Calling CQ. This is KD8JXM looking for anyone who might know the status of Havenbrook Valley area. I have family there. ... 2 daughters. Been trying to reach them for days. Kira and Juniper both froze, their faces going pale in the lantern light. That voice, Kira whispered. Juniper, do you hear that? The radio crackled again. This is Frank Stone, former military, currently in Colorado. My daughters are Kira and Juniper Stone, and I haven't heard from them since Tuesday. If anyone in the Havenbrook area is listening. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls as two sisters stared at each other in shock. And Gideon realized that their refuge held more than just shelter from the storm. It held the key to a miracle none of them had expected. Silence in the storm cellar stretched for several heartbeats after Frank Stone's voice faded into static. Kira and Juniper sat frozen, staring at the radio as if it might suddenly sprout wings and fly away. The lantern light flickered across their faces, revealing a mixture of disbelief, hope, and something that looked almost like fear. That was ... Juniper started, then stopped, her voice catching. Our father, Kira finished, her military composure cracking completely. That was definitely our father. Gideon looked between the two sisters, sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. You haven't heard from him since Tuesday? That's only a few days ago. Kira let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. Try 3 years. We haven't heard from our father in 3 years. Daniel looked up from the photograph he'd been studying. 3 years? That's a really long time. It is, buddy, Gideon said. Gently, then turned back to the sisters. Do you want to try to respond? Juniper seemed to know how to work the radio equipment. Juniper was already moving back toward the radio setup, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the dials. I can try to reach him on the same frequency, but amateur radio isn't like a phone call. He might not be listening anymore, or atmospheric conditions might have changed. She picked up the microphone with hands that trembled despite her obvious technical competence. This is KD8JXN, responding to KD8JXM. Frank Stone, if you're still monitoring this frequency, this is Juniper. I'm here with Kira. We're safe, Dad. We're safe. Static filled the cellar. Juniper tried again, repeating the call sign and message, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. But only silence answered. Sometimes it takes a while, she said, setting the microphone down but keeping her eyes on the radio. Signals bounce around, especially during storms. He might hear us even if we can't hear him responding. Kira had wrapped her arms around herself, and Gideon noticed she was shivering despite the relative warmth of the shelter. Here, he said, offering her one of the cedar-scented blankets. You're still soaked from the rain. The rain. Thank you. She accepted the blanket gratefully, then looked at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone only 23 years old. You're probably wondering why we haven't spoken to our father in 3 years. It's none of my business, Gideon said, but his tone made it clear he was willing to listen if they wanted to share. Daniel had found another lantern and was trying to figure out how to light it. Gideon helped him, and soon the cellar was filled with even more warm light, making the space feel less like a bunker and more like a cozy room. Our mom died when we were 15, Kira continued, settling back against the stone wall. Car accident during a winter storm, actually. Dad. He didn't handle it well. Juniper looked up from the radio. He started drinking, a lot. Lost his job, lost the house. We ended up in foster care for our last few years of high school. We joined the army partly to get away from all that, Kira added. And partly because we thought if we became soldiers, maybe he'd be proud of us. Maybe he'd get his life together. Gideon felt his heart ache for these young women who had clearly been through far more than their share of loss. Did it work? For a while, Juniper said. He got sober, found work. We started talking again during our first deployment. But then, she paused, adjusting the radio dials again, listening for any sign of their father's voice. Then what happened? Daniel asked with the directness that only children possess. Kira smiled sadly at him. He disappeared, literally. Left his apartment, quit his job, sold his car. We came home from our second deployment, and he was just gone. No note, no forwarding address, nothing. We hired a private investigator, Juniper added. Spent our savings trying to find him. The investigator traced him as far as Colorado. But then the trail went cold. Gideon thought about his own struggles with loss. How easy it would be to just walk away from everything that reminded him of Emma. The difference was Daniel, his son, anchored him, gave him a reason to keep fighting. Through the grief, but if he'd been alone, maybe he needed time to figure things out, he suggested. Grief makes people do things that don't always make sense. Maybe, Kira said, but she didn't sound convinced. Or maybe he just realized he was better off without the responsibility of two daughters who reminded him of everything he'd lost. The radio crackled suddenly, making all four of them jump. Juniper lunged for the microphone. Double quotes ... repeat. This is KD8JXM. Juniper, Kira, if that was really you, please respond. I've been looking for you for so long. Dad, Juniper practically shouted into the microphone. Dad, it's really us. We're in a storm shelter near Havenbrook Valley. There was a tornado, but we're safe. Oh, thank God, Frank Stone's voice came through clearly now, and even through the radio static, his emotion was unmistakable. I can't believe. Are you both okay? Are you hurt? Kira moved closer to the microphone, tears streaming down her face. We're okay, Dad, both of us, but where have you been? We've been looking for you everywhere. A long pause filled the airwaves. I know, sweetheart. I know, and I'm so sorry, I thought. I thought you'd be better off without me. After everything I put you through. That's not your decision to make, Juniper said, her voice firm, but not angry. We're your daughters. We get to decide if we want you in our lives. I'm in Colorado, Frank said. I've been working at a fire lookout station in the mountains. No phone service, no internet. Just me and a radio. I've been trying to reach anyone who might know where you were stationed, but we're not deployed anymore, Kira said. We're home on leave, visiting Grandma Morrison. Grandma's on a cruise, Juniper added, which earned a sound that might have been a laugh from their father. Of course she is. That woman's been traveling more since she turned 70 than most people do in their whole lives. Daniel had been listening to the entire exchange with wide eyes. Mr. Gideon, he whispered, this is like when you find something you thought was lost forever. Gideon nodded, watching these two young women reconnect with their father through an old radio in an underground shelter while a tornado's aftermath raged above them. It was exactly like that. Dad, Kira said into the microphone, there's someone here we want you to meet. A man named Gideon Beckett. He risked his life to rescue us from the storm. Sir, Frank Stone's voice came through the radio. I don't know how to thank you. Gideon took the microphone from Kira. No thanks necessary. Anyone would have done the same. No, sir, they wouldn't have. Trust me on that. As the radio conversation continued, Gideon realized that the storm shelter had become something more than just a place to wait out the tornado. It had become a place where broken things could start to mend, where families could find each other again, and where strangers could become something more. Daniel tugged on his sleeve. Dad, are we going to help them find their father? Gideon looked at his son, then at the two sisters who were taking turns talking to their father through the radio, and realized that somehow, in the space of a few hours, his definition of family had begun to expand. Yeah, buddy, he said. I think we are. As the radio conversation with Frank Stone continued, the storm cellar began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a sanctuary, where truths could be spoken safely. The lantern light created an intimate atmosphere that seemed to encourage honesty, and the shared experience of surviving the tornado had broken down the usual barriers between strangers. "Dad," Juniper said into the microphone, "we need to talk about why you left. Really talk about it." A long silence stretched across the airwaves before Frank's voice returned, heavier now. "I know we do, sweetheart. I just ... I never knew how to explain it in a way that would make sense." Kira took the microphone from her sister. "Try us. We're not 15 anymore." Another pause. "After your mother died, I felt like I was drowning every single day. But when you two went into foster care, I convinced myself it was temporary. That I'd get clean, get my life together, and bring you home. By the time you joined the army, I was sober and working, but ... double quotes. But what?" Juniper prompted gently, but I realized how much damage I'd done. How many birthdays I'd missed because I was drunk. How many times you needed a father and got a broken man instead. When you were deployed, I got letters from other parents talking about how proud they were of their soldier children. And all I could think was that you'd become amazing despite me, not because of me." Gideon found himself leaning closer to the radio, recognizing something in Frank's words that resonated with his own fears about parenting Daniel alone. "So when you came home from your second deployment," Frank continued, "and I saw how strong and capable you'd become, how you'd built lives without needing me, ... I thought the best thing I could do was disappear. Let you keep building without the weight of a father who'd failed you." "Dad," Kira's voice was thick with emotion, "that wasn't your choice to make. I know that now. But grief ... grief makes you think crazy things make sense." Daniel, who had been quietly listening while organizing some of the emergency supplies, looked up at Gideon. "Is that why you sometimes sit in the car after we get home and don't come inside right away?" Gideon felt his face flush. He hadn't realized Daniel had noticed those moments when he needed a few extra minutes to compose himself before facing the evening routine. The reminders of Emma's absence in every corner of their house. "Sometimes, buddy," he admitted. "Sometimes. I need a minute to remember how to be the dad you need." Kira and Juniper both turned to look at him, and he realized he'd just revealed more about his own struggles than he'd intended. "How long has it been?" Kira asked gently. "Since your wife passed?" 8 months, 2 weeks, 3 days, Gideon said automatically, then caught himself. "Sorry, I don't usually count it out loud like that. We counted the days after Mom died." 2, Juniper said. "For the first year anyway, it's normal." Frank's voice crackled through the radio again. "Mr. Beckett, are you a single father?" Gideon took the microphone. "Yes, sir." "Daniel's 8. We're figuring it out as we go." "That's the hardest job in the world," Frank said. "I failed at it spectacularly, but you sound like you're doing better than I ever did." "I don't know about that," Gideon replied. "Most days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water. Emma was the one who knew how to do everything, cook meals Daniel would actually eat, remember when his library books were due, explain why the sky is blue or how thunderstorms work. I'm good at building things, fixing things that are broken. But parenting ... double quotes. But you saved us today," Kira pointed out. "You drove straight into a tornado to help 2 strangers. That takes the kind of courage that can't be taught." Daniel nodded emphatically. "And you always make sure I brush my teeth, even when you forget to brush yours." Despite everything, Gideon laughed. "Thanks for outing me, buddy. What was she like?" Juniper asked. "Your wife?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, surprised by how much he wanted to share. Usually when people asked about Emma, he gave brief, polite answers and changed the subject. But something about being trapped underground with these people made it feel safe to remember out loud. She was ... sunlight, he said finally. Emma could walk into a room and somehow make everyone feel like they were the most interesting person she'd ever met. She taught 3rd grade, and her students adored her because she had this way of making learning feel like an adventure. She could turn a math lesson into a treasure hunt, or explain photosynthesis by pretending to be a leaf. She sounds wonderful, Kira said softly. She was. And the thing is, she knew she was dying for months before we told Daniel. But instead of getting bitter or scared, she spent that time making videos for all his future birthdays, writing letters for him to open when he graduates high school and gets married. She even recorded herself reading his favorite bedtime stories, so I'd have her voice when he needed it. Gideon's throat tightened. The last thing she told me was to make sure Daniel knew that love doesn't end just because someone dies. That families can grow in ways you don't expect. Smart woman, Frank's voice came through the radio. Sounds like she knew you'd find your way. Did she know you'd take risks to help strangers? Juniper asked. Actually, yes, Gideon said, realizing it was true. One time, maybe 6 months before she got sick, we were driving home from a movie and saw a car broken down on the highway. I wanted to keep driving. It was late. We had Daniel in the car. It wasn't really safe to stop. But Emma made me pull over anyway. Turned out it was a young mother with a baby, and her car had overheated. We drove them to a gas station, helped. Her call for help. And what did she say about it? Kira asked. She said that love is a verb, not just a feeling. That the point of building a good life isn't to keep it safe, but to use it to help other people build good lives too. Daniel had moved closer to his father during this story. Is that why we helped the lady with the groceries last week? And why you fixed Mr. Chun's fence without asking for money? Yeah, buddy, I think it is. Frank's voice returned to the radio, thoughtful now. Mr. Beckett, it sounds like your wife understood something I took 3 years alone in the mountains to figure out. What's that? That running away from the people you love doesn't protect them from your pain. It just adds your absence to their list of things to grieve. Kira wiped tears from her eyes. Dad, we grieved you for 3 years. We thought you were dead, or that you decided we weren't worth staying for. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Both of you. I thought I was being noble, but I was just being a coward. Juniper had been adjusting the radio settings, and now she looked up with a determined expression. Well, you're not dead, and we're not giving up on you now. What's your exact location in Colorado? I'm at Bridger Peak Fire Lookout, about 40 miles west of Boulder. But girls, I don't expect you to. Dad, Kira interrupted, we just survived a tornado. Driving to Colorado is nothing compared to that. Besides, Juniper added, glancing at Gideon and Daniel, we might not be making that trip alone. Gideon felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and fear he'd carried for months. These people, these strangers who had become something more in the space of a few hours, were offering him something he hadn't even known he needed, the chance to be part of a larger story, a bigger family. Are we going on a road trip? Daniel asked, his eyes bright with excitement. I don't know, buddy, Gideon said, looking at Kira and Juniper. Are we? Frank's voice crackled through the radio one more time. Mr. Beckett, if you're seriously considering bringing my daughters to Colorado, I need you to know something. I've been alone up here for 3 years, and I'm probably going to be a mess when I see them. But if you're the kind of man who drives into a tornado to save strangers, then you're the kind of man I'd trust with my girl's safety. Dad, Kira said, we can take care of ourselves. I know you can, sweetheart. But sometimes it's okay to let someone else help carry the load. As if summoned by those words, the radio crackled with an official emergency broadcast. The tornado warning for Havenbrook County has been lifted. Emergency crews are beginning damage assessment. Residents are advised to remain in shelter until roads are cleared and utility lines are confirmed safe. Looks like we're here for a while longer, Juniper said. Gideon looked around the storm cellar, at the emergency supplies left by long-ago homeowners, at the radio equipment that had reconnected a broken family, at the strangers who were becoming friends, at his son who was already treating Kira and Juniper like the big sisters he'd never had. "I can think of worse places to be," he said. And for the first time since Emma died, he meant it completely. The emergency broadcast had reported that the worst of the storm had passed, but none of them seemed eager to leave the shelter just yet. Something had shifted in the underground space. What had begun as a desperate refuge from the tornado had evolved into something more intimate and intentional. The four of them had arranged themselves in a loose circle around the radio, sharing the emergency supplies like an impromptu picnic, while Frank's voice continued to drift through the speakers. "Dad," Juniper said, settling back against the stone wall with a cup of water and some crackers they'd found among the supplies, "tell us about the fire lookout. What's it like up there?" Frank's answer came through clearly now, the radio signal having stabilized as the atmospheric conditions settled. "It's quiet, really quiet. At first, that was exactly what I needed. No noise, no distractions, just me and the mountains. But after a while, the quiet started feeling less like peace and more like punishment." Gideon found himself nodding as he helped Daniel arrange a makeshift bed from some of the blankets. He understood that kind of quiet the way silence could shift from being restful to being oppressive, especially when you were using it to avoid dealing with painful realities. "What changed?" Kira asked. "What made you start trying to reach us?" "About 2 months ago, I was monitoring emergency frequencies during a wildfire in the next valley over. I heard families calling out for missing relatives, search and rescue, teams coordinating to reunite people. And I realized that I'd been treating my grief like it was protecting you from my problems, when really I was just creating a different kind of problem. The problem of wondering if your father was dead or alive." Daniel looked up from his blanket arranging. "That's like when I hide my sad feelings so Dad won't be more sad. But then he worries that I'm sad about something else." The simplicity of the observation hit Gideon squarely in the chest. "You do that, buddy? Sometimes. Like when I miss Mom but I don't want to make you cry again." Gideon felt the familiar tightness in his throat, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a recognition that his grief had been so consuming that he'd missed some of Daniel's emotional needs. "Daniel, you never have to hide your feelings to protect mine. Missing Mom... that's something we should do together." "Really?" "Really, your sadness doesn't make mine worse. If anything, it reminds me that we both loved her, and that's something good we share." Kira had been listening to this exchange with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Dad, when you disappeared, Juniper and I started doing the same thing. We stopped talking about Mom because talking about her reminded us that you were gone too. It was like we lost both parents at once." "That's exactly what happened," Juniper added. "And then we convinced ourselves that being strong meant not needing anyone. Military training reinforced that be self-sufficient, don't show weakness, complete the mission no matter what." "But being strong doesn't mean being alone," Gideon said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I'm learning that the hard way." Frank's voice crackled through the radio again, and this time there was something different in his tone, less weighted with shame, more curious and forward-looking. "Mr. Beckett, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you balance giving?" Daniel spaced to grieve with making sure he knows he's not alone in it. Gideon considered the question carefully. It was something he'd been struggling with for months, trying to model emotional honesty without overwhelming his 8-year-old son with adult-sized grief. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted. "But I think Emma gave me a roadmap without realizing it. She used to say that feelings aren't problems to solve, they're experiences to share. So when Daniel misses her, instead of trying to make him feel better, I try to miss her with him." "What does that look like?" Kira asked. Yo piped up before Gideon could answer. "We look at pictures and tell stories about her. And sometimes we cry, but it's not scary crying. It's like missing her together feels better than missing her alone. Smart kid, Frank said through the radio. Sounds like his mother raised him well. She did, Gideon said. But you know what's interesting? Today, helping you three, feeling useful to people who needed something I could give. That's the first time in months I've felt like maybe I'm not just surviving. Maybe I'm actually living again. Juniper had been fiddling with the radio dials, and she paused to look at him. You saved our lives today. That's not just living. That's being a hero. I don't know about hero, Gideon said, but Daniel nodded. Emphatically. You are, Dad. You're like the heroes in the stories Mom used to read. The ones who help people even when it's scary. Scary. Kira smiled at Daniel, then turned to Gideon. Emma sounds like she was an amazing teacher. I bet she would have loved to see you helping us today. She would have, Gideon realized. She probably would have packed a whole picnic basket for the storm cellar and somehow made this feel like an adventure instead of a crisis. Maybe we can still make it feel like an adventure, Daniel suggested. Like we're explorers who discovered a secret underground base. With a magic radio that connects. Lost families, Juniper added, entering into the spirit of the game. And emergency supplies left by previous explorers. Kira continued. Frank's laughter came through the radio speakers, and it was a sound that transformed everything, not the bitter laugh of someone who'd given up, but the genuine amusement of a father who was remembering how to find joy in his daughter's voices. I haven't heard you two be silly in years, he said. God, I miss that. We haven't felt silly in years, Juniper admitted, but something about today, ... Maybe it's the tornado, or maybe it's finding you, or maybe it's meeting Gideon and Daniel, but I feel like maybe it's okay to be more than just soldiers. Maybe it's okay to be daughters again too. Gideon found himself studying these two young women, really looking at them for the first time since the crisis had passed. The military bearing was still there, but underneath it he could see glimpses of the girls they'd been before loss and responsibility had shaped them into soldiers. Kira had a mischievous glint in her eyes when she looked at Daniel, and Juniper had unconsciously started humming while she worked with the radio equipment. You know, he said slowly, Emma used to say that sometimes God puts people in your path. Not because you need to save them, but because they need to save you. Do you think that's what happened today? Kira asked. Gideon looked around the storm cellar, at Daniel who was more animated than he'd been in months, at Kira and Juniper who were beginning to look like sisters instead of just soldiers, at the radio that had made the impossible connection possible. I think, he said, that we all saved each other. Frank's voice came through the radio one more time, softer now, more vulnerable. Girls, I know I have no right to ask this, but when you said you might drive to Colorado ... did you mean it? Kira and Juniper looked at each other, one of those silent conversations that only siblings can have passing between them. Dad, Kira said finally, we've been looking for you for 3 years. We're not going to stop now. But, Juniper added, we're not the same girls who went into foster care, and you're probably not the same man who left. We're going to have to figure out how to be a family again. I'd like that, Frank said. I'd like that more than anything. Daniel tugged on Gideon's sleeve. Dad, can we go to Colorado too? I've never seen mountains. Gideon felt something inside his chest expand, not the tight, anxious feeling he'd carried for months, but something warm and open and full of possibility. What do you think? He asked Kira and Juniper. Room for 2 more on this family reunion? The sisters exchanged another look, and this time they both smiled, the first completely unguarded smiles he'd seen from either of them. I think, Juniper said, that would be perfect. The emergency all clear came through the radio at 6:47 p.m., along with an announcement that Millfield Road had been cleared of debris and was safe for travel. The moment that information crackled through the speakers, The atmosphere in the storm cellar shifted subtly but unmistakably. The urgency that had bound them together was lifting, and with it came the unspoken question that nobody wanted to address. What happened next? Gideon was the first to break the spell, standing and stretching muscles that had grown stiff from hours of sitting on the stone floor. "We should probably check on the truck, see if it survived the storm." The practical statement felt like cold water after the warmth of their extended conversation. Daniel looked up from where he'd been arranging the old family photographs they'd found, his expression suddenly uncertain. "Are we leaving now?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made Gideon pause. "Well, buddy, the roads are open. People will be worried about us." "What people?" Daniel asked with the devastating logic of childhood. "Mrs. Chun from next door? She's visiting her sister in Kansas. Uncle Mike? He thinks we're camping this weekend anyway." Gideon realized his son was right. In the 8 months since Emma's death, their social circle had narrowed considerably. The married couples who had been their friends seemed uncertain how to relate to a widowed father, and Gideon had been too overwhelmed with basic survival to maintain most relationships. The truth was, aside from his work crew, there probably wasn't anyone who would even notice they were missing until Monday morning. "Dad, I called into my commanding officer before the storm hit," Kira said, seeming to read the situation. "Told him we might be delayed getting back to base because of weather. We've got another week of leave. And I already told my boss I might take some time to deal with family stuff," Juniper added. "So there's no rush from our end either." Frank's voice came through the radio, tentative but hopeful. "If you're all thinking about making that drive to Colorado, you should know the road up to the Lookout Station isn't exactly easy. It's a 4-wheel drive track, pretty rough in good weather. And I don't have much up here in terms of accommodations." Gideon found himself studying the two sisters, looking for signs of what they were really thinking. The military discipline was back in their posture now that the immediate crisis had passed, but he could see something else underneath it, a careful guardedness that suggested they'd learned not to count on things working out. "How rough is rough?" he asked Frank through the radio. "About 12 miles of dirt road, some pretty steep switchbacks. And the cabin isn't much, one room, wood stove, no electricity except what I generate with a small solar setup." "Not exactly a vacation destination." Daniel perked up at this description. "It sounds like camping." "Dad, remember how Mom always wanted to take me camping in the mountains?" Gideon did remember. Emma had grown up spending summers at her grandfather's cabin in the Ozarks, and she'd always talked about wanting to show Daniel what real wilderness looked like. It was one of the many plans that cancer had stolen from them. "It's a long drive, buddy. Probably 8 or 9 hours to Colorado, then however long to get up to the Lookout." "I know," Daniel said seriously. "But Kira and Juniper need to see their dad, and we could help them. And maybe—" he paused, looking suddenly shy. "Maybe it would be like having a family adventure, the kind Mom wanted us to have." The words hit Gideon like a physical blow, but not in a painful way. More like recognition, the sense that his 8-year-old son understood something about moving forward that Gideon was still struggling to grasp. Kira stood and began pacing the small space of the storm cellar, her military training evident in the precise, economical movements. "Mr. Beckett, Gideon, you don't owe us anything more than you've already done. You risked your life to save us today, gave us shelter, helped us reconnect with our father. That's more than anyone could expect from a stranger." "We're not strangers anymore," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "Strangers don't share emergency crackers and tell stories about their families." Juniper smiled at that, but her expression remained serious. "Daniel's right about that, but Kira's also right. This is a big decision. You'd be taking time off work, spending money on gas and hotels, driving hundreds of miles to help 2 people you met 6 hours ago. And for what?" Kira added, her pacing becoming more agitated. To reunite with a father who abandoned us for 3 years? Who might decide to disappear again the minute things get difficult? Frank's voice came through the radio, heavy with pain. Kira, sweetheart, I know you have every reason not to trust me. I know that, do you? Kira interrupted, her composure finally cracking. Because, Dad, I've been carrying your dog tags for 3 years. 3 years of not knowing if you were dead or alive, if we should grieve you or keep hoping. Do you know what that does to a person? She pulled a set of military dog tags from under her shirt, holding them up to the lantern light. I wear these every day. Juniper thinks I'm crazy, but I couldn't let go of the idea that you might come back. And now you're here, on a radio, asking us to drive across the country to see you. How do I know you won't disappear again the minute this reunion gets messy? The silence that followed was deafening. Even the radio static seemed to quiet, as if the universe was holding its breath waiting for Frank's answer. You don't, he said finally. You have absolutely no guarantee that I won't mess this up again. All I can tell you is that I've spent 3 years alone thinking about all the ways I failed you, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try again. Juniper had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she looked up from the radio equipment with tears in her eyes. Kira, I get it. I really do. But what if we don't go? What if we walk away from this and spend the next 3 years wondering what might have been? What if we go and he breaks our hearts again? Kira countered. Then at least we'll know we tried, Gideon said quietly. All 3 of them turned to look at him, and he realized he was as surprised by his words as they were. Sorry, I didn't mean to. No, Juniper said. Say what you were thinking. Gideon looked at Daniel, who was watching the conversation with the intense focus that meant he was learning something important about how adults navigated difficult decisions. When Emma was dying, Gideon said slowly, the doctors gave us a choice about an experimental treatment. It was risky, expensive, and probably wouldn't work, but it might give us a few more months together. Emma wanted to try it, and I was terrified not of losing her, but of giving her false hope, of making her suffering worse for no reason. He paused, remembering those agonizing conversations in hospital rooms that smelled of disinfectant and fear. In the end, we decided that we'd rather fail trying than succeed at giving up. The treatment didn't work, but those last few months, we used them well. We said things that needed saying, made memories that mattered. Kira had stopped pacing and was staring at him intently. And you think this is the same thing? I think, Gideon said carefully, that the only guarantee in life is that you'll regret the chances you don't take more than the ones you do. And I think Daniel is right. We're not strangers anymore. We're people who helped each other through a crisis. And maybe that's worth building on. Frank's voice crackled through the radio again. Girls, I need you to know something. If you decide not to come, if you decide you can't trust me with another chance, I'll understand. But I won't disappear again. I'll find a way to stay in contact. To earn back your trust slowly, even if it takes years. Promise? Kira asked, her voice small and vulnerable in a way that revealed the 15-year-old girl who'd lost her father along with her mother. I promise, sweetheart. On your mother's memory, I promise. Daniel had been following this entire conversation with the seriousness of a judge, and now he stood up and walked over to Kira. My mom used to say that families aren't just the people you're born with. They're the people who choose to love you even when it's hard. Kira looked down at this wise 8-year-old boy, and something in her expression shifted. Your mom sounds like she was pretty smart. She was. And she would have liked you and Juniper a lot. How can you be sure? Daniel smiled with complete confidence. Because you helped Dad remember how to be brave. Gideon felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his son, this remarkable little person who had somehow learned to see hope where adults saw only risk. Juniper stood up and walked over to her sister. "Kira, I think we should go. Not because I'm not scared, but because I am scared, and I think that means it matters." Kira looked around the storm cellar at the radio that had brought their father's voice back into their lives, at the emergency supplies that had sustained them through the crisis, at the man and boy who had risked everything to help them. Then she looked at the dog tags in her hand. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, we'll go to Colorado. Really?" Daniel bounced excitedly. "We're really going on a mountain adventure?" "Really," Gideon confirmed, feeling a mix of excitement and terror that reminded him of the moment he'd decided to drive into the tornado. "We're really going." Frank's voice came through the radio one last time, thick with emotion. "Thank you, all of you, for giving an old fool another chance." As they began gathering their things and preparing to leave the storm cellar, Gideon realized that they were walking away from more than just a temporary shelter. They were leaving behind the people they'd been that morning, the grieving widower, the lonely sisters, the abandoned father, and stepping into something new and uncertain and full of possibility. It was terrifying. It was also the most alive he'd felt since Emma died. "Colorado, here we come," Daniel announced, and Gideon couldn't help but smile at his son's confidence that this adventure would somehow make everything better. Maybe it would. And maybe, for the first time in months, that was enough. The drive to Colorado began at dawn the next morning, after they'd spent the night at a hotel in Havenbrook Valley. The tornado had damaged Gideon's house, nothing catastrophic, but enough. Broken windows and roof tiles to make it uninhabitable for a few days. He'd called his insurance company and arranged for emergency repairs, then found himself standing in the hotel parking lot at 6 a.m., loading camping gear into his truck while Daniel bounced excitedly between the vehicle and the hotel lobby. "Did you remember the s'mores supplies?" Daniel asked for the fourth time, clutching a small backpack that contained what he considered essential road trip provisions: a deck of cards, 3 books about mountain animals, and a stuffed elephant named Murphy that had been his constant companion since Emma's death. "I remembered," Gideon assured him, though truthfully, Kira had been the one to suggest they stop at a grocery store for camping food. She and Juniper had emerged from the hotel that morning, transformed from the bedraggled storm survivors he'd rescued into something that looked more like their true selves, confident, capable young women who moved with military precision but smiled with genuine warmth. "I still can't believe we're doing this," Juniper said, settling into the passenger seat of Gideon's crew cab truck. They decided to travel together rather than taking 2 vehicles, which meant an intimate 9-hour drive during which they'd either become genuine friends or discover that their crisis-forged bond wouldn't survive the reality of normal circumstances. Kira climbed into the back seat next to Daniel, who immediately began showing her his collection of travel activities. "Did you know that Colorado has 58 peaks over 14,000 feet? He informed her seriously. "I learned that from Mom's geography books." 58? Kira said with equally serious consideration. "That's a lot of peaks." "Do you think we'll see any of them?" "Dad says maybe. He says where we're going is pretty high up." As they pulled out of Havenbrook Valley, Gideon found himself thinking about the phone call he'd made to his work foreman the night before. He'd explained about the storm damage to his house and asked for a few days off to deal with family matters. What he hadn't explained was that the family matters involved 2 Army veterans he'd known for less than 24 hours and a road trip to reconnect them with their missing father. "You know," he said aloud, "when I woke up yesterday morning, if someone had told me I'd be driving to Colorado today with 3 people I'd never met, I'd have suggested they check themselves into a mental health facility." "Life's funny that way," Juniper said. "In the Army, we had a saying, plans are just suggestions you make to the universe before it shows you what's really going to happen." "Is that why you both seem so calm about this?" Gideon asked. "Military training?" Kira laughed from the back seat. "Are you kidding? I threw up twice this morning from nerves. Juniper stress cleaned our entire hotel room at 5 a.m. You cleaned? Daniel asked with admiration. I hate cleaning. Nervous energy, Juniper explained. Some people pace, some people clean obsessively. What do you do when you're nervous, Daniel? I ask a lot of questions, Daniel said promptly. Like, are we really going to sleep in a cabin with no electricity? And what if Mr. Frank doesn't like me? And what if his cabin doesn't have a bathroom? All excellent questions, Gideon said. And I don't have answers to any of them. That's okay, Daniel said with the confidence of a child who trusted that adults would figure things out. Adventures are supposed to have some mystery. The first few hours of the drive passed easily, conversation flowing between them like they'd been friends for years rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. Juniper proved to have an encyclopedic knowledge of roadside attractions, directing them to stops that included the world's largest ball of twine and a diner that claimed to serve the best pie in Kansas. Kira appointed herself entertainment coordinator, leading car games and teaching Daniel military hand signals that made him giggle with delight. But as they crossed into Colorado and the landscape began to change from flat farmland to rolling hills, then to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, the mood in the truck shifted. The reality of what they were doing, driving to meet a man who had abandoned his children for 3 years, began to settle over them like a weight. Dad hasn't seen us since we were 20, Kira said quietly, watching the mountains grow larger. On the horizon, we were babies when he left. Now we're adults with military experience, deployment scars, opinions about things he's never even heard us discuss. People change, Gideon said. But the important stuff usually stays the same. What if the important stuff was what was broken to begin with? Juniper asked Dot. It was a question that hung in the air as they drove deeper into the mountains, the road becoming narrower and more winding with each mile. Gideon found himself thinking about the version of himself from a year ago, the man who'd been so focused on Emma's illness that he'd barely noticed the world outside their crisis. That man would never have driven into a tornado to save strangers, would never have agreed to a spontaneous road trip to Colorado. Was that growth, or just desperation wearing a different mask? There's the turnoff, Juniper said, consulting the detailed directions Frank had transmitted via radio the night before. Bridger Peak Fire Road, 12 miles to the lookout station. The road was everything Frank had warned them about and worse. What started as rough gravel quickly deteriorated into a dirt track riddled with potholes and washouts from recent rains. Gideon's truck handled it well, but the going was slow, with frequent stops to navigate around fallen logs or particularly challenging sections. This is like a real adventure, Daniel announced as they bounced over a particularly large rock. Like explorers going to find a lost kingdom. Let's hope the kingdom we find is friendlier than most lost kingdoms in stories, Kira muttered, but she was smiling as she said it. 3 hours after leaving the main highway, they finally reached a small clearing where a dirt parking area had been carved out of the mountainside. Above them, perched on a rocky outcrop and connected to the parking area by a steep trail, stood the fire lookout station, a small wooden cabin mounted on stilts, with windows on all sides and a radio antenna reaching toward the sky. And standing on the narrow deck that wrapped around the cabin, looking down at their truck with an expression of wonder and terror, was Frank Stone. Even from a distance, the family resemblance was unmistakable. He had the same tall, athletic build as his daughters, the same dark hair, though his was now streaked with gray, and the same intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, and his hands gripped the deck railing like he needed the support to remain standing. "Oh God," Kira whispered. "That's really him. Are you okay?" Gideon asked, noticing that both sisters had gone very still. "No," Juniper said honestly. "But I think that's normal." They climbed out of the truck slowly, and Gideon could feel the emotional weight of the moment settling over all of them. This wasn't just a family reunion, it was the collision of 3 years of grief, Anger, hope, and desperate love, all compressed into this single moment on a mountainside in Colorado. Frank descended the trail from the cabin with careful, deliberate steps, and Gideon could see that his hands were shaking. When he reached the bottom, he stopped about 10 feet away from his daughters, as if unsure whether he had the right to come closer. "Kira," he said, his voice breaking on the name. "Juniper, you're here. You're really here." "We're here," Kira sighed, but she didn't move toward him. "We're here, but Dad, I need you to understand that this isn't automatically okay. This doesn't erase the last 3 years." Frank nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know, sweetheart. I know it doesn't." "We need to talk," Juniper said. "Really talk. About everything. About why you left. About what happens now. About whether we can trust you not to disappear again." "Yes," Frank said immediately. "Yes, whatever you need." Daniel, who had been watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing something completely outside his experience, stepped forward and extended his hand with formal politeness. "Mr. Frank," he said, "I'm Daniel Beckett. My dad saved your daughters from the tornado, and now we're all here to help your family figure things out." Frank looked down at this serious 8-year-old boy and managed to smile through his tears. "Daniel Beckett," he said, shaking the offered hand solemnly, "it's an honor to meet you. And you must be Gideon." Gideon stepped forward, trying to read the situation. Frank Stone looked like a man who'd been living alone in the wilderness for 3 years, lean, weathered with the kind of stillness that came from spending long hours in solitude. But his eyes were clear and present in a way that suggested the isolation had been healing rather than destructive. "Thank you," Frank said, gripping Gideon's hand firmly, "for saving them, for bringing them here, for ... He gestured helplessly. "For being the kind of man who would do all this for strangers." "They're not strangers anymore," Gideon said, echoing Daniel's words from the storm cellar. "And honestly, I think we all saved each other." Frank looked between his daughters and the man and boy who had somehow become part of their family crisis. "Would you ... would you all like to come up? See the cabin? I don't have much, but there's coffee and the view." "The view would be great," Juniper said, and Gideon could hear her making a deliberate choice to move forward rather than staying frozen in this moment of uncertainty. The climb to the cabin was steep but short, and the view from the deck was indeed spectacular. The fire lookout was positioned to provide a 360-degree view of the surrounding mountains, with valleys stretching in every direction and peaks rising like monuments against the sky. It was the kind of landscape that made human problems feel both insignificant and deeply meaningful at the same time. The cabin itself was sparse, but comfortable. One room with a bed, a small kitchen area, a desk covered with weather instruments and radio equipment, and a wood stove that provided heat. Books were stacked everywhere, and the walls were covered with maps, weather charts, and what looked like 3 years' worth of journals. "This is where you've been living?" Kira asked, turning slowly to take in the entire space. "It's not much," Frank said apologetically, "but it's been ... peaceful." "It's beautiful," Daniel said with genuine appreciation. "You can see everything from up here." Frank showed them around the small space, explaining his duties as a fire lookout, the daily weather reports he filed, the journal he kept of wildlife observations. There was something calming about his voice as he talked about his routine, the rhythm of solitary life in the mountains. But underneath the calm, Gideon could sense the nervous energy of a man who was trying to prove that his exile had been productive rather than destructive. "Dad," Juniper said finally, settling into one of the 2 chairs at the small table, "we need to have the hard conversation now." Frank nodded and sat across from her, while Kira remained standing by the window. And Gideon and Daniel found places on the narrow bed. "Why did you really leave?" Kira asked. "Not the version you told us on the radio about thinking we'd be better off without you. The real reason." Frank was quiet for a long time, staring out at the mountains. "I was afraid," he said finally. "After your mother died, I felt like I'd failed at the most important job I'd ever had, being a husband and father. When I started drinking, when you went into foster care, when I couldn't seem to put the pieces back together, ... I started believing that failure was all I had to offer." "So you left," Juniper said. "It wasn't a question. When you joined the army, you became these strong, capable women who didn't need me anymore. And I thought maybe the kindest thing I could do was get out of your way. Let you build lives without having to carry the weight of my mistakes." "But that wasn't your choice to make," Kira said, her voice tight with old anger. "We needed you to fight for us, not protect us from yourself." "I know that now," Frank said. "Being up here, alone with my thoughts for 3 years. I know that now." Daniel, who had been listening to this exchange with rapt attention, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Frank, did you think about them every day?" "Every day," Frank confirmed. "Every single day." "Then you didn't really leave them," Daniel said with 8-year-old logic. "You just moved your body somewhere else, but your heart stayed with them." The simple statement hung in the air, and Gideon saw something shift in both sisters' faces, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of a truth they hadn't considered. "Maybe," Kira said slowly, "the question isn't why you left. Maybe it's whether you're ready to stay now." Frank looked at his daughters, then at Gideon and Daniel, then back at his daughters. "I want to try," he said. "I want to try to be the father you deserve, even if I have to learn how all over again." "It's going to be messy," Juniper warned. "We're all different people than we were 3 years ago." "I know, and it's going to take time," Kira added. "Trust has to be rebuilt slowly. I know that too." "And," Gideon said, surprising himself by joining the conversation, "it's going to require all of us figuring out what family looks like when it's not just the people you were born with." Everyone turned to look at him, and he realized he'd just committed himself and Daniel to something he hadn't fully thought through. "I mean," he continued, "if that's what everyone wants, this thing we built yesterday and today ... it feels real to me. It feels like something worth keeping." Daniel nodded emphatically. "I like having big sisters," he announced. "And Mr. Frank seems nice, even if he made some mistakes." Kira looked at Juniper, and one of their silent conversations passed between them. Then Kira turned to Frank. "Okay," she said, "we'll try." "But Dad, if you run away again..." "I won't," Frank said firmly. "I swear to you I won't." As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful to be real, 5 people who had been strangers 2 days ago sat together on the deck of a fire lookout station and began the complicated work of becoming a family. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward silences and moments of tension, old wounds that would take time to heal. But there was also laughter when Daniel tried to spot wildlife through Frank's binoculars, and gentle teasing when Kira admitted she'd never made s'mores before, and quiet moments of connection that felt like the beginning of something lasting. As they prepared to make camp for the night, Frank had insisted they stay at least until the weekend. Gideon found himself thinking about Emma's words about love being a verb, not just a feeling. Looking around at this unlikely group of people who had chosen each other, he thought she would have understood exactly what was happening here. They were choosing love. Messy, complicated, uncertain love that required daily commitment rather than just good intentions. It was the most terrifying and hopeful thing Gideon had done since Emma died, and for the first time in months, he was sure it was exactly what she would have wanted for him and Daniel. 6 months later, the sound of laughter echoed across the mountain clearing as Daniel chased Kira around the newly constructed fire pit, both of them covered in marshmallow, remnants and chocolate from what had been declared the most epic s'mores battle in recorded history. The April evening was warm enough for shirt sleeves, and the last rays of sunlight painted the peaks around them in shades of gold and pink that never seemed to lose their power to inspire awe. "I surrender," Kira called out, collapsing dramatically onto one of the log benches that Frank and Gideon had built around the fire pit. "Daniel Beckett, you are officially the s'mores champion of Bridger Peak. I told you I was good at this," Daniel said proudly, settling beside her with the satisfaction of someone who had just defended his title successfully. At 9 now, he had grown taller and more confident, but more importantly, he had learned to carry his grief for his mother alongside, his joy in his expanding family rather than letting one diminish the other. Juniper looked up from the camping chair where she was tuning Frank's old guitarra, skill she'd rediscovered during their extended stays at the lookout station. "The real question is whether our s'mores champion is ready for the big announcement." "What announcement?" Daniel asked. Immediately alert to the possibility of adventure, Gideon and Frank exchanged a look across the fire. Over the past 6 months, they had developed the kind of easy communication that came from spending extended time together working on practical projects, building the expanded deck on the lookout station, constructing the guest cabin that now provided more comfortable accommodations for their increasingly frequent visits, clearing trails through the surrounding forest that had become Daniel's favorite exploration routes. "Well," Gideon said, settling onto the bench beside Daniel, "you know how we've been coming here every other weekend, and how much you love the mountains. And you know how Kira and Juniper have been talking about what they want to do when their army contracts are up next year." Frank added. Daniel nodded, his eyes growing wide with anticipation. "And you know how I've been working with the State Forestry Service on that remote cabin construction project?" Gideon continued. "Dad, are you trying to tell me something exciting?" "In the most boring way possible?" Daniel asked with exasperated affection. Kira burst out laughing. "He's got your number, Gideon." Okay, Gideon said, grinning at his son. "The exciting news is that the state has offered me a permanent position as a construction supervisor for remote facilities throughout this region of Colorado. Which means if we wanted to, we could move here, actually live here." Daniel was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness he brought to all major life decisions. "What about our house? What about my school? What about Mrs. Chun?" "Mrs. Chun has been talking about moving to Kansas to be closer to her sister anyway," Gideon said. "And there are good schools in Boulder, which is only about an hour drive down the mountain. As for our house," he paused, thinking about the modest rental in Havenbrook Valley that had never quite felt like home without Emma. "I think it's time for a new house. Maybe one with a better view. And," Juniper added, "Kira and I have been accepted to the University of Colorado. I'm going to study environmental science, and Kira's going into education." "You want to be a teacher?" Daniel asked Kira with delight. "Like Mom was?" "Maybe," Kira said softly. "I think I'd like to try working with kids who need extra support. Kids who might be dealing with difficult situations at home." Frank had been quietly listening to this conversation, but now he spoke up. "There's something else. The Forestry Service has asked me to expand my role here. Instead of just being a fire lookout, they want me to develop an educational program about wilderness safety and conservation. Bring school groups up, teach people about living responsibly in wild spaces. So we'd all be here?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with wonder. "All of us living near each other? If that's what you want, buddy," Gideon said. "What do you think?" Daniel looked around at the faces surrounding the fire, at Frank, who had taught him to identify different bird calls and how to read weather patterns in the clouds, at Juniper, who had shown him how to tie knots that would hold in any storm, and shared her extensive knowledge of mountain wildlife, at Kira, who had become the big sister he'd never known he wanted, someone who could make him laugh until his stomach hurt and who listened to his worries with the same seriousness she'd bring to military intelligence. "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that Mom would like it here." "Yeah?" Gideon asked, his throat tightening with emotion. "She always said that home wasn't a place, It was the people who loved you. And all the people who love me are here. Kira reached over and ruffled Daniel's hair. All the people who love you are going to be wherever you are, Mountain Monkey. But I have to admit, this place has grown on me. Grown on you? Juniper teased. You're the one who spent 3 hours yesterday photographing wildflowers to send to your army buddies. They were really good wildflowers, Kira protested with mock indignation. As the evening settled around them and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Frank added another log to the fire and settled back in his chair. The past 6 months had transformed him from the haunted, isolated man they'd first encountered via radio into someone who seemed genuinely at peace with himself and his place in the world. He'd put on healthy weight, started laughing regularly again, and most importantly, had learned to trust himself with his daughter's hearts. You know, he said, when I first came up to this mountain, I thought I was running away from family. Turns out I was just waiting for the right one to find me. We didn't find you, Daniel pointed out with his characteristic precision. The tornado found us, and then we found each other. Smart kid, Frank said with a smile. Although I think maybe the tornado was just the delivery method. I think we were supposed to find each other all along. Gideon found himself thinking about the man he'd been 6 months ago, overwhelmed, isolated, focused so completely on just surviving each day that he'd lost sight of the possibility that life could be more than endurance. That man would never have imagined sitting around a campfire in the Colorado mountains, part of a family that included 2 Army veterans and a fire lookout who collected vintage radio equipment. I have something for everyone, he announced, reaching into his backpack and pulling out a small wrapped package. It's not much, but ... He handed the package to Frank, who unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small leather journal with Stone Beckett Family Adventures embossed on the cover. I thought we could keep track, Gideon explained. All the places we go, the things we do together. So Daniel will have something to show his kids someday about how families can start in the most unexpected ways. Frank held the journal like it was made of precious metal. Gideon, this is ... This is perfect. Can I write the first entry? Daniel asked eagerly. It's your family too, buddy. Of course you can. As Daniel carefully opened the journal and began writing in his neat 3rd-grade handwriting, Juniper started playing a soft melody on the guitar, something that sounded like a cross between a lullaby and a campfire song. Kira leaned back against the log bench and closed her eyes, listening to the music blend with the sound of wind in the pines and the distant call of a night bird. What are you writing? Frank asked Daniel. Today we decided to become a real family. Daniel read aloud. Not because we have to, but because we want to. Dad says that's the best kind of family. Also, I beat Kira at s'mores again, and she claims I cheated, but I think she's just a sore loser. I did not claim you cheated, Kira protested, but she was laughing as she said it. Should I cross that part out? Daniel asked innocently. Absolutely. Matt, Frank said. That's the kind of detail that makes history come alive. As the fire burned down to glowing embers and the mountain settled into its nighttime quiet, they began making plans for their new life together. Gideon would give notice at his job in Missouri and start the process of relocating to Colorado. Kira and Juniper would finish their current deployment and transition to civilian life as college students. Frank would work with the Forestry Service to develop his educational programs and help design the expanded facilities that would support their growing family operation. There's one more thing, Kira said as they prepared to head to their respective cabins for the night. Juniper and I have been thinking about changing our last name. Changing it to what? Frank asked, surprised. Well, Juniper said, Stone Beckett has a nice ring to it. You know, to make it official that we're all part of the same family now. Gideon felt his eyes fill with tears. You'd do that? You'd do that? Dad, Kira said gently, you saved our lives. You brought us back to our father. You showed us what it looks like when someone chooses to love you, even when it's inconvenient or scary. If that doesn't make you family, I don't know what does. Besides, Daniel added pragmatically, Stone Beckett sounds like the name of people who go on really good adventures. Later that night, after Daniel had fallen asleep in the guest cabin and the sisters had settled into their own space, Gideon and Frank sat on the deck of the lookout station, sharing a beer and looking out at the star-filled sky. I keep thinking about what Daniel said, Frank reflected. About the tornado being just the delivery method, about us being supposed to find each other. You think there's something to that? Gideon asked. I think, Frank said slowly, that my girls needed to know they could trust someone other than each other. And I think you needed to remember that taking care of people didn't have to be a burden, that it could be a joy. Gideon nodded, thinking about Emma's letters that he still read sometimes when he missed her most. In her last one, she'd written about hoping he would find ways to let his love expand rather than just preserve it, to build something new while honoring what they'd had together. Emma would have loved this place, he said. She would have loved all of you. She sounds like she was pretty wise. She was. She used to say that love was like a fire. If you tried to keep it contained, it would eventually burn out. But if you let it spread, it could warm more people than you ever imagined. Frank was quiet for a moment, then said, I think she'd be proud of what you've built here. We built, Gideon corrected. What we built. The next morning brought the kind of crystal-clear mountain dawn that made everything seem possible. Daniel was up first, as usual, eager to help Frank with the morning weather observations and radio check-ins. Kira and Juniper emerged from their cabin looking refreshed and ready for the hike. They'd planned to a nearby waterfall that Frank had been promising to show them for months. As they packed lunches and filled water bottles, Gideon found himself marveling at how naturally they'd all fallen into these routines, how easily they'd learned to move around each other in the small spaces, how quickly they'd developed the kind of shorthand communication that usually took years to build. Ready for an adventure, Mountain Monkey? Kira asked Daniel as she shouldered her backpack. Always, Daniel replied with a grin that reminded Gideon so strongly of Emma that his heart ached with joy rather than grief. The hike to the waterfall took them through some of the most beautiful terrain Gideon had ever seen. Meadows filled with wildflowers, groves of aspen trees that would be spectacular in the fall, rocky outcrops that provided views of distant peaks. Daniel ran ahead on the trail, then circled back to share his discoveries, his excitement infectious and boundless. When they reached the waterfall, a 50-foot cascade that tumbled into a crystal-clear pool, they spread out their lunch and settled on the sun-warmed rocks to eat and talk and simply be together. I want to remember this exactly, Daniel announced, looking around at the group. This moment, this place, all of us here. That's what the journal is for, Frank reminded him. I know, but ... Daniel paused, trying to find the words for something important. I want to remember how it feels, not just what happened, how it feels to have a family that chose each other. Juniper reached over and squeezed his hand. We'll all remember, Daniel. This is the kind of moment that sticks with you forever. As they prepared to hike back to the lookout station, Gideon took one last look around at the waterfall, the mountains, the faces of the people who had become his family in the most unexpected way possible. Tomorrow they would drive back down the mountain to begin the practical work of reshaping their lives around this new reality. There would be logistics to manage, challenges to overcome, moments of doubt and difficulty. But today, in this moment, everything felt exactly as it should be. That evening, as they sat around the fire for their last night of this particular visit, Daniel made the final entry in the family journal. Today we went to a waterfall and decided that some things are too beautiful to describe in words. But we also decided that having a family who chooses to love you is the most beautiful thing of all, even when it starts with a tornado. Dad says Mom would have said that love always finds a way, and I think she was right. The end of this adventure, but also the beginning. Frank closed the journal carefully and looked around at his chosen family, these remarkable people who had transformed his exile into a homecoming, his daughter's wounds into wisdom, and a stranger's courage into the Kofi, foundation of something lasting and true. "Here's to new beginnings," he said, raising his coffee mug in a toast. "Here's to family," Kira replied. "Here's to love finding a way," Juniper added. "Here's to adventures," Daniel concluded. "Here's to all of it," Gideon said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As the fire burned low and the stars emerged overhead, the Stone Beckett family settled into the comfortable quiet of people who had found their way home to each other. One choice at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.